may be seated. If we have anyone that wants to head over towards Children's Church, Brittany's going to be leading the crew over that way, so you can go ahead and take off and go over that way. For everyone else, if you have your Bible with you or something you read your Bible on, we're going to be based out of the book of Matthew this morning, Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. So if you want to go ahead and turn to that, or if you want to scan these codes, I've got several links in your notes this morning. If you get on the digital notes, as Trevor mentioned, there's always the reading plan that goes right along every week with what we're talking about on Sunday mornings. But also today, I've given you two. Gosh, I don't know what that was there. I felt like I swallowed something. I don't know. My tongue or something? I don't know what went on there. But there's also going to be some stuff I'll talk to you a little bit about later. But let's go ahead and let's begin by looking at Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now, I want to go ahead and say this at the outset this morning. I hope by now that you have, if you've been here for a while, hopefully you know this by now, but everything that I do at the beginning of the message, it may seem a little weird to you at some point. It does, right? I know some of the things that I get into, but I have to get all of us in the right mind frame for where I come from to get to the truth of God's Word. So just hold on to that for a second, because we're going to go some weird places here. But first, I want to ask you this question. Do you know how to rest? Do you know how to take a break from work? Do you know how to take a weekend off? Do you know how to take a vacation? Anyone? Do you know how to rest? Do you know how to relax? Do you know how to do all that sort of stuff? Well, we this morning are in the 4th week of this series that we're calling Rhythm. Learning how to live life in tune, learning how to live life in time, learning how to live life in step with Jesus. And what we're doing during this series is we're working towards an understanding that God has an intended design for our lives. And that intended design for our lives works best when we are living, once more, in step with Jesus. You know, there is a rhythm that God has designed this life to work best. Unfortunately, there are many other rhythms that want us to stay in step with them. There are many other rhythms within this world that want us to live just within drum beat with them. Or even there are some rhythms in this world that want us to just live out of rhythm completely. And due to the competing rhythms in this world, we have to stay focused. If we are to be the people of God, we have to stay laser-like focused so that we can align our lives with the rhythm of God. Okay, hopefully we understand this is where we're coming from. This is where we're going, because here we're going to start getting weird, because I want you to do a little bit of an exercise with me this morning. On the screen, hopefully you will see a picture of some musical notation. Now, I want you to forget that, Shelby, I know you're playing music in your head over there, and you're like, well, it's all, whatever that is. But I just want you to pay attention to the quarter notes. That's what those notes are. Those are quarter notes. And so if we understood like what the beats per minute of the rhythm was, then we would play this like this. We'd just be like 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Practice with me real quick, okay? Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if I sped it up, we'd be like that, okay? We're not going to do that this morning. So now the next one, I want you to look at this. We're going to get a little trickier here, because now we have added in some eighth notes, which are played just twice as fast as the quarter notes. Then we have a half note at the end. So we're going to do this together. Ready? 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, and 3, 4. Did I do that right, musical people? Did I do that sort of right? Okay. Now we're going to get a little trickier. We're adding in a new notation. It already says it up there for you, but what is the new notation we have? It's a rest, right? So we don't play the rest. We go 1, 2, 4. Can we do that? Let's do it together. I want you to rest like that too. 1, 2, 4. All right. You've got it. Somebody wanted to hit one of those on there. we need to understand today, we're not talking about musical theory, okay? That's not what I'm talking about this morning because I've just very barely scratching the surface of musical theory. But we have to understand that the rest, when it is inserted in the music, so often we think that the rest is put into music just to like give the musicians a break. They're just tired of playing, and so they don't sing or they don't sound their instrument at that point of time. But we need to understand that without the rhythm of both music and rest, notes and rest, and whatever groove you're playing is not filled out. It's not fleshed out completely. I mean, when you're listening to music, do you ever notice the pauses that come in a piece of music? I was running this week, and I was racking my brain while I was running, and I was listening to different songs, and I was like, do these songs have pauses in them? And I was thinking about, like, what are some of the famous pieces of music that have, like, these pauses built into them? And the first one I thought of was this, and it was the Foo Fighters' Monkey Wrench. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Foo Fighters, but they begin this intro to this song, and it's this really hard guitar riff, and all of a sudden it's just like, nothing. Then he kicks right back into it. Maybe this one's more your style. Does anybody remember this song, Walking in Memphis by Mark Cohn? This was a big song like back in the late 80s, early 90s. And he's building this bridge up at the very end. And he's talking about this place in Memphis that has catfish on the table and gospel in the air. And he says, Reverend Green will be glad to see you when you haven't got a prayer. But boy, you got a prayer in Memphis. You see, did you like that little dramatic pause he inserts there? Or maybe that's not your musical style either. So how about this classic piece of music? All I do is win, no matter what. Money on my mind, I can never get enough. Every time I step up in the building, everybody's hands go. Thank you. I saw hands go up over there. And then what? Nothing, right? Your hands are just up. Until what? And they stay there. And they stay there. Up, down, up, down. Okay. That's enough of Matt's DJ Khaled. But hopefully you get the point this morning that rests are important to music. But not only that, rests are important for your body, for your physical body. But rests spiritually are important for your soul too. Rest is important for your soul. And when we're talking biblically about a rest, we're talking about a concept known as something called the Sabbath. Maybe you're familiar with that word. We just read it from Matthew chapter 12, but we're talking about the Sabbath this morning. Now, if you really want to get literal this morning, the Hebrew word that we get Sabbath for is transliterated from the word Shabbat. And what that word actually meant was to quit, to cease, to rest, to stop. And I have to add this because I put it online this week. Stop and do what? Collaborate and listen. That's enough of my music this morning. So we're done with all the music for a moment. But it just means to cease, to stop, to rest, to quit, and to do what? To just be. Do you ever remember a time in your life when it was slower? Betty, you're shaking your head. I know you're all the time doing something, running after somebody. Do you ever remember a time in your life when things just were slower than they are now? You know, when you're a kid, you don't have anything else to do than what? Play. And then you come to mom and dad and you're like, well, I'm bored. We hear that sometimes in our house, but you don't have anything to do. And then the same thing happens to all of us. We get older, and our time gets less and less, but our calendars get what? Fuller and fuller and bigger, and we seemingly have no time to do anything. And with all of this like fast-paced living, there are results that come from our fast-paced living. And I didn't say benefits. There are results that come from our pace of life. Time is something that we no longer get to enjoy, but it's something we're racing against. In the American Psychological Society, they said that more than 3/4 of adults report some form of emotional symptom, or physical or emotional symptoms of stress. Anyone in here among those 3/4? symptoms of stress, either physically or emotionally. You know, for all of our advancements in technology, and when the advancements in technology were really taken off, so many people believed that technology would get to such a point at one day that we would have all this leisure time, that we would not have to do anything because all the technology would do it for us. But what it has really done to us, it's cut down on our quality of life. Because we can work at such a fast pace, we try to work faster. Because we can live at such a fast pace, we try to live harder and stronger. And some of these stats are just kind of eye-opening for the things that directly relate from our lack of rest. 42% of people report the experience of irritability or anger. And I actually think that's a little low. Go on a Facebook comment section. Be with me when I'm in the pickup line after school. Irritability and anger are high. 39% of people report the feeling of anxiety. Probably a little low as well. The other people were too anxious to answer it, I guess. 37% of people report tiredness. Another 37% of people report depression or sadness. You see, we are a stressed out people living in a stress-filled world. We just are. And our pace of life is adding to it. Once again, my mind works so strange. I was thinking, does anybody remember Saved by the Bell? Remember the show Saved by the Bell? We're all like Jessie from Saved by the Bell, who in her simpler time, she was addicted to caffeine pills. Does anybody remember that very special episode? Wendy, I know you do. But before she gave her, I'm so excited, I'm so excited, I'm so scared, when she was talking about not having enough time, she said, there's never any time. We don't have enough time. And she started listing all the stuff she didn't have time for. And I would venture to say, in a room like this, there are some people who feel the same way. I never have enough time. I don't have enough time. You know, there are some areas of our culture that are starting to push back against this. And I consider it one of the ironies of all ironies that Google, who exists to make our lives just faster, what they do for their workers is in some of their places they have like trampolines where people can take a break. They have like sleep pods or these sort of things. And they also give their workers, I thought this was interesting, they give their workers 1/5 of their workday just to wander and let their minds think. 1/5 of their workday to do this. Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is the heart of tech. No, it's probably your world, right? You just in line with some of that sort of stuff. But they regularly observe what they call an internet Sabbath, where they unplug all of their devices for an entire weekend to get away from what? From what they're pumping into our lives. More and more, it is non-religious people who are seeking to disconnect from the frantic pace of their world. Not in a God-honoring Sabbath like what we're going to be kind of just brushing the surface of this morning, but this internal desire to slow down that they don't even know where it came from. You see, we were created with an internal desire to live from a rhythm of both work and rest. But instead, we're working for rest instead of working from rest. And I want you to understand that for a second. We work for rest. What's that song once again? I can't help it. Working for the weekend. We're working for rest instead of working from rest. Think about this. We're willing to lose sleep just so that we can maybe one day give ourselves permission to slow down. I just got to get through this project. I got to get through this week. I got to get through this season. We're willing to push relationships to the back burner just so maybe one day, hopefully, we can give someone else our undivided attention. We're willing to go without intentionally spending time with, connecting with, delighting in, and worshiping God, just so we can maybe one day when things are quieter and I don't have this going on or that going on or this other thing comes up, then I'll give Him my undivided focus and attention. You see, the rhythm of life that God intended, this rhythm of life that God intended to work best includes both work and rest. You see, God didn't intend for the Sabbath to become something that maybe many times we hold it out to be. What He intended for it to be was just this ceasing, this resting, this quieting, this stopping. Not that it's something that we're like, well, once everything else is done, then I'll get around to it. But He intended it to be a necessary pause in our lives, so we can learn to relate to Him in the way that He relates to the world. You see, the rhythm of life that God had in store for us. Let's go back to our clapping exercise real quick, if you will. It was 7 days, 6 to work, 1 to rest. Was it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's how God created the world, and that's how God designed us to exist in the world, all the way back and woven into the fabric of creation. In Genesis chapter 1, we read this, that God saw all that He had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. And by the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So God spoke. The earth was formed. Sun, moon, stars put in their place. The sea and the land, they take their places. All the vegetation grows up. God creates animals of the sea, animals of the sky, animals of the land. Then he creates humans. And then we're told on the seventh day, after God has done all of this work, we're told that God rests. Not that God was tired. God has limitless power. God was not tired, but what God was doing for the beings who were created in his image, he was giving us a pattern of which we are to look at our lives and live our lives. And I don't know about you, but I often think that things work best in life when who's in charge of them? Me. And maybe you feel that way about your life too. Maybe you think things work the best when you're in charge. If I'm not on top of this, if I'm not straining myself to do it, or that old classic, if I don't do it, nobody else will. We often think that things don't work, and so we're constantly on the go, we're constantly on the move, we're constantly on the clock. But what God invited us into in this Sabbath rest was a welcome to be with him, was a welcome to be still and know that he is God. Why? Why did he say one day a week to take out and do it like this? Because he knows the rest of our days are hard. And he knows the rest of our days are filled with trouble. And he knows the rest of our days are filled with work. So he invites us to be with him, to be in him, and to rest. And you may be sitting there this morning. You may be offended at what I'm saying. I do take time off, Matt. I take a break, take a vacation here and there. Well, that's great. But unless we are building an intentional time to delight in God, all we're doing is just taking a day off without taking Sabbath rest like it was intended to be made. That time was intended to rest in God, not just for ourselves. And if we're constantly working for rest, that time in the future when we'll unplug, when we'll unwind, when we'll unburden ourselves from the daily grind, then we will more than likely burn out along the way. We'll burn out along the way, but if we learn to work from rest, as God intended life to work, then we may learn to realize that we're not the ones in charge here anyway, and that God is in control, and so that we can trust him. Pastor and author John Mark Comer writes this about the Sabbath. He says, Sabbath is a way of working from rest, not for rest, with nothing to prove. It's a way of bearing fruit from abiding, not ambition. You see what God did when he rested? God did not stop being God. So often our lives are so wrapped up in the things we do that becomes our whole life. So if we think, well, if I take a break from this, I won't be myself anymore. But what God did when he rested from creating, he was still God. He was still the creator. He just ceased from doing on one day that creating work. And unlike the other 6 days of creation, if you read the Genesis account, those other 6 days of creation, we're told that it is evening and it is morning and it is the next day. But when we get to the seventh day, we don't have that. We don't have evening and morning and then the seventh day, because before the fall, all of creation was meant to live in this ongoing abiding with, of resting in God. But the entrance of sin, the entrance of man and woman choosing that they knew better than God how to be in control of their own lives, you see, that brought that Sabbath rest to an end. You see, the Sabbath wasn't so much supposed to be just a day as God originally instituted. It was supposed to be this time where they would cease to strive. They were still working in the garden, but they would cease to strive, and they would just enjoy that God was with them and that God was ruling and God was reigning. You see, they rebelled against God, and when they did that, they broke the Sabbath. They broke God's intent for creation. And the Sabbath was then given later on as a commandment in Exodus chapter 20, and we'll look at this in a moment, but it was given as a commandment to God's people. Pastor and author Pete Scazzaro, he talks about this time in Israel's life, and he writes this. He said, Israel has lived as slaves in Egypt for over 400 years, and throughout those 400 years, they never took a day off. Never took a day off for 400 years. They were treated as tools of production to make pyramids. They were doing machines. They worked 7 days a week all year long. They never observed or experienced a rhythm of work and rest. Living meant performing tasks with one day blurring into the next. And I pause here to ask, how often does that sound like our existence? One day just blurring into the next, no break. He says, when God called Israel out of Egypt, he affirmed they were sacred human beings made in his image. He then showed them how to live according to their God-given nature. The longest and most specific of the 10 commandments is the fourth. And the fourth is God's commandment about observing the Sabbath. And it's captured for us in Exodus 28 through 11. God tells the people to remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, eat neither of you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. See, God was making this day separate by both action and inaction. They were to remember it, which is action. They were to keep it holy, which is action. But they were also supposed to just rest and know God. A people who had worked so hard for 400 years were invited into the rest of God. And traditionally, that day for 3,500 plus years has been observed on Friday night at sundown to Saturday night at sundown by the Jewish people. Now, today as Christians, we believe that Jesus Christ has freed us from many of those technicalities of the law, including that strict observance of the Sabbath like that, because Jesus is now the rest for our souls. We enter into a rest in Jesus now, and we look forward to one to come. But there are still some principles that a New Testament believer can apply. And it might be something we want to remember for our lives today. When we remember that God has invited us into a Sabbath rest, I want you to understand this. It is an acknowledgement that we're not God. God rested, but God didn't need to rest. Anyone in here have unlimited strength and unlimited power? No hands? I saw some of that clapping. It was weak. No, it's a reminder that we're not God and that who is? That he is. It's a reminder. It's an acknowledgement that we trust God. When we allow ourselves the time to stop and focus on God, then we begin to do what Jesus invited us to pray last week, to know that our daily bread even comes from this God who is the ruler of the universe. It's also an acknowledgement that we need God. It's far too easy to take the focus off of God and put it on myself. But when we pause and we spend time with this God away from the busyness of everyday life, it helps us put ourselves in the proper place that we were intended to be. God, here, my priorities maybe have to take a back seat. You know, by the time we move into the New Testament, the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day, they had turned the Sabbath into just this hard, oppressive burden upon the people. We have such a talent as human beings to take the good, life-giving things that God has given us and make them these life-choking things. We do it with all sorts of stuff. We do it with identity. We do it with sexuality. We do it even with just taking time to rest in God. And Jesus sees how far the people have gone from what God had intended to be good and how they were distorting it and how they were abusing it, and with it they were abusing the people. And that's what we read earlier from Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. So now, hopefully, with these thoughts of the Sabbath just fresh in your mind, I want you to hear one more time Jesus' interaction with the religious leaders. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, the day they were to be resting, the day they were to be doing nothing, and his disciples were hungry. So they began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." And he answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." We give the Pharisees such a bad reputation throughout Scripture because Jesus was often complaining about these guys many times to their faith. But one thing the Pharisees had going for them was their strict devotion to the law of God. They loved the law of God, and so they elevated it and tried to hold it up in front of the people. But what they had done at this point in time is they had loaded up so much other stuff on the law of God that it made it unbearable for anyone to live up under. And it is hard for me today, and it may be hard for many of us, to understand what life as a first century Jewish man or woman might have looked like. We know that Sabbath means to rest and not work, but follow this out with me. There are so many other laws that were put in place to observe the Sabbath more so than any other commandment. Sabbath means resting for working, but is not going into the office enough. Sabbath means resting for working, but what about work around the house? And what about cooking your food? That's work for somebody, right? And what about cleaning up after your meal? Well, that's work for somebody else because Matt doesn't want to do that, you know? Or what about even walking? How far can we walk and it's not constituted as work? Or what about even tying our shoes or doing all this other stuff? You see, what the Sabbath had become in those days and this life-giving thing that God had given, it had become less about delighting and resting in God and more about the people trying to find out, how much can I do and still be okay with the law? We do this today with a lot of stuff. How much can I get away with and still be, we're good, God? And that's what the Sabbath had become. You see, there was a time in between our Old Testament and New Testament when these Jewish revolutionaries were like raising up and revolting against the Romans. It's not in our Bibles, but it is historically said that one of the groups was known as the Maccabees. And the Maccabees, they had 1,000 people who were following them killed on one day. You know why? Because they were attacked on the Sabbath and they thought defending themselves was work. 1,000 people lost their lives because of their interpretation of the Sabbath. In Matthew, the Pharisees get mad at Jesus because their disciples are picking heads of grain, rubbing it in their fingers, and eating what was left over. They said that was reaping, they said that was harvesting, and they said that was cooking food. And so because of that, y'all broke the law. Because of their interpretation. And Jesus draws their minds back to David. He says David once ate the bread that was consecrated for the priests. And what Jesus is saying here, he's saying that if David was okay by eating the bread that symbolized the presence of God, how much more my disciples when they're what? When they're actually in the presence of God. Jesus draws their mind to a law about the priests in the book of Numbers. He said the priests are breaking the Sabbath by going in and doing work and doing all these sacrifices. Jesus is saying, well, how much more are my disciples when they are in the presence of someone who is greater than the temple? You see, Jesus is cutting at the heart of two of the central things in the faith of the Jewish people in those days. Jesus is saying, I'm greater than the Sabbath. Jesus is also saying, I'm greater than temple worship. And he's putting himself above those things, and it's making the people so mad. It is making them so mad, and you'll see here in a second when we look at this from the book of Mark, just what Jesus is doing. But Jesus said in Mark chapter 2, as Mark gives us another perspective, he says that the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. You see, the Pharisees had gotten it the other way around, and so they put all these heavy burdens upon the people. They weren't enjoying what God had meant for them to enjoy, which was God himself and time to be with him. In Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, Jesus goes into the synagogue on another Sabbath day, and there's a man there who's deformed. He's got a shriveled hand, and there were people there who are wanting to accuse Jesus, and they want to see what Jesus would do. So Jesus tells this man, he heals him as he asks him to stand up in front of everyone. And he asks the people, he says, what's lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill it? And the guy stretches out his hand, and Jesus heals him. And then we read this. The Pharisees went out and began to plot how they might kill Jesus. Do you notice the contrast in their responses? On a day that was meant to give life, Jesus gave this man a new lease on life. But when the one who said, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, is in their midst doing something that's against their interpretation of the law, what do they want to do to Jesus? Kill him. They want to kill him. They want to kill him. You know, it's so easy to think, well, I need some time to rest. It's so easy to think, well, I need to have a break in my schedule or maybe just a time to set aside to get alone with God. And there are many people today who are living out some of these practices. There are many people even who are sharing their experiences with Christians today so that we can learn to incorporate this rhythm of rest and work in our lives. I mentioned earlier in your notes, if you've got the digital notes, there's a link there to a pastor and author by the name of Pete Scazzaro. And he wrote a book called Emotionally Healthy Church, Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. But there's a devotional in there if you want to read about that. Also, John Mark Comer is doing something called Practicing the Way. There's a link in there for that too. And he talks about this rhythm of work and rest often that he has seen in his life. Now, the main thing I want you to hear this morning is this. I don't talk about all this stuff morning for Matt or anyone else in this place to beat ourselves up when we don't get it right. That's not what this is. It's life-giving, not life-choking. It's a gift. You see, we're no longer under the law, but we have been set free to rest in God's goodness at all times through Jesus Christ. But there is value to be found in setting aside time intentionally to rest. Give yourself a break, people. Give yourself a break. Give yourself a break. Sabbath was a part of God's intent and design for our lives to work best, but it was meant to be once more life-giving and not life-choking. We all need time to fellowship with God. We all need intentional time set apart to fellowship with God, to cease from our striving, to stop and remember that what? That our salvation, it's not by my works. It's by faith alone in God. To remember that God provides for all of our needs, and we can trust Him. That Jesus is the only one who ultimately satisfies our souls. None of the stuff we're chasing after. And that our commands to love God and love others, if we're not living that out, if all we're looking at in our life is stress, irritability, and anger and bitterness, then maybe we need a reset. And we need a refresh. And we need to learn to rest in God. In a moment, we're going to close in a song of response. Trevor, if you guys want to come back up. What I want to invite you to do this morning, I want to invite you maybe during this time of prayer and response is just to rest in God. I know that sounds odd in a room like this, but just spend a few moments this morning as we're singing, just quieting your soul and resting in God. The God who invites you to know who He is. If a doctor prescribed you a certain course of treatment, you would not look at the doctor and say, what right do you have to impose your doctor convictions on me? Because the doctor could look at you and be like, you know what, I'm not imposing my standards on you. I know your body works this way, so I'm giving you this course of treatment. Well, in the same way, the creator of the universe has given us a pattern of living that makes sense for our lives. For those who are made in His image to function best. Finding the time to do this and to build this in our lives, it may sound difficult. It may sound like one more thing that we're just adding on and, I got to check off this list now. That's not what I'm talking about this morning. We need to be proactive about it, though. You can't just drift into finding time to rest in God. So I want to give you just 5. Can't count this morning. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. I want to give you 5 things that maybe you can take with you. These are in your notes. They'll be on the screen. Number 1, how can you build this into your life? You can be intentional about it. You won't rest unless you plan for it. Something's always going to come up. Second thing, choose a day. Choose a time. I would like to maybe choose some time when we gather together like this. To build this into a regular routine. But whatever works for you and your family, understand the purpose of the Sabbath. It's not to be something you just add to your list. It's meant for reset. It's meant for worship. Don't make it an obligation. Again, it's not something that God's like, if you don't do this, I'm going to get you. That's not what any of this stuff is about. Life-giving, not life-choking. And then finally, the main thing about this is to enjoy God. If you just take time off just to take time off and don't enjoy God, then you're not having Sabbath. You're just taking time off. You're just taking a break from everything else. We were meant to enjoy a loving relationship with God from which everything else in this life flows from. I'm not sure how we need to build this into our lives. I'm not sure in your life how you see it even playing out, but I'm inviting you in this space and this time right now to ask Him. Ask Him. See what He says, and then begin to build it into your regular rhythm. It's the way we were meant to live. If you will, let's pray, and I'm going to let you respond in song. God, we thank you so much for your word to us. I pray that in these moments that you would just open us up to hear from what your Son has said through this word about Him. Jesus, I thank you that you give us rest for our souls, that we spend so much time striving and ceasing and doing that we forget to simply just be. Be in your presence, be with you, be your children. Remind us that you're in these moments now with us, that you go with us when we leave this place, and that your commands were not meant to be burdensome upon us, but they were meant to give us life as you intended it to be lived. We thank you for the gift of life. We thank you for the very breath in our lungs. We thank you for your Son who came and lived and died so that we could be set free to live with you and for you. We pray this all in His name. Amen.